It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. You know, we spend a lot of time on this show talking about how trauma shows up in people's lives, but there's a specific kind of wound that researchers and clinicians say has been hiding in plain sight for decades. It pertains to war and deaths in war and other things. It's called moral injury, and it doesn't come from what was done to you, but from what you did, what you witnessed, or what you failed to prevent when it cut against the grain of some of your own deepest values. Michael Valdovinos, a clinical psychologist, veteran, and trauma specialist, defines it this way in his new book. He writes, "Moral injury occurs when we make choices that so violate our conscience and produce such unbearable consequences that we come to see ourselves as irredeemably bad people." Now, that concept was born in the study of veterans, soldiers who came home not just haunted by fear or violence, but by something harder to name, something that sometimes comes from the deaths that they inflict in a war. But Valdovinos argues in his new book, Moral Injuries, When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt, that this wound isn't confined to the battlefield. Michael Valdovinos joins us now. His book is Moral Injuries, and it's out now. Michael, thank you so much for joining us for this. Welcome to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
And before we get into the book, by way of introduction, you are a clinical psychologist, a trauma specialist, and a veteran who served in Afghanistan. That's an unusual combination of credentials to bring to a single subject. How did those three identities converge into this book?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I would say that all of it converged into this book. I think, I write the book from a bipartisan manner, but really trying to not just create a language for folks to sort of name what they might be feeling, but also I try to give real world examples of how my life, both growing up, but also my professional life, examples of moral injury in those contexts and how it showed up for me, how I discovered it, and some strategies about what I did to try to repair myself.
And so you write about arriving in Afghanistan during your service in the military. You write, "I naively assumed that the Afghan people welcomed our assistance. I wanted to give my all to our humanitarian mission, and I considered it an added honor to represent my community as one of the few Mexican-American U.S. Air Force officers on base deep in Afghanistan's Parwan province. That pride lasted just 3 days," unquote, from your book. So what happened in those 3 days?
Yeah, so, it was a really interesting sort of development, and it was a little bit of a shock to myself. This is not something I was anticipating because, as you said, I did go to Afghanistan with quite honestly some excitement and enthusiasm. I was, of course, leading a small team of behavioral health experts to uphold the Geneva Conventions as it related to detention operations and interrogation operations following what President Obama rightfully, I think, said, no more enhanced interrogation techniques. So he wrote that into law. We were there to protect against that. And so I felt proud of the work I was doing. But about 3 days in, what ended up happening for me is I started really trying to reconcile not just what I was doing there as a psychologist beyond what I was trained to do, but more broadly, kind of analyzing the whole campaign about winning hearts and minds. Oddly enough, I remember I brought some binoculars with me, and I could see over the T-walls, which are these big 20, 30-foot concrete walls that are around the base. And where I was sleeping, I was upstairs. I could see over the walls. And as I was looking out into the local villages around Parwan, I could actually see people on motorcycles riding by. I could see people going about their day. It felt like, sort of, a normal environment within this like broader structure of war. And that for me was really, I think, shocking. It kind of shook me in a way where I started to reflect back on my youth in Mexico, going to see my family in rural villages in Michoacan. And I think there was a lot that came up for me there in this idea that I sort of knew that we weren't going to win their hearts and minds. You can't forcefully impose a way of life on people, that generally doesn't work. It's certainly not sustainable. And yet that's exactly what we were doing. Now we, of course, have seen the ramifications of that. But at day 3, knowing that I had to be there for 6 months, that was a really tough pill for me to swallow. And while my job wasn't to convince other people to live the way we do and believe in the things we do, I was part of a larger system that, in effect, that's what was there to do.
So how did that rupture between what you thought you were going there idealistically to do and the realities that you perceived in those first 3 days shape the argument you're making in this book?
Yeah, well, I actually didn't know what was happening. I felt, a bit of depression. I felt anger. I felt resentment. I felt confusion. There were some symptoms of shame and guilt, and I sat with that. So I didn't actually do something about that the 3 days in. I think it might have been at least a few weeks after where I came upon, and I write about this in the book, I came upon a program that was at Par 1 to help detainees acclimate outside of detention, where they were taught how to farm. And again, there was this sort of cathartic moment for me where I came upon this. Just imagine a concrete sort of jungle. In the middle, there's this organic, lush garden. I walked by it, and I remember just reflecting sort of, again, what I was doing, what was my mission there? What was the broader mission there? And suddenly there was sort of this rush of emotion that kind of overcame me. That's completely the way that it felt. And it sort of was one of those moments where your life kind of flashes by in a moment, but there's 1,000 sort of thoughts and memories that come through. For me, I sort of felt that was sort of my breaking point. And this is not, this was an accumulation, I think, of moral distress and moral injury throughout my life, which I write about. But it was, I think, that moment that for reasons that, I'm a 4th generation farmer. My parents are migrant farm workers. My father is, there was this moment that for me really sort of, encapsulated this idea of what moral injury is. And so, of course, without knowing what it was, I went back and I started looking it up and doing research on it. And there emerged this term moral injury. And it made a lot of sense to me. I started putting memories to these feelings. I started putting specific periods of my life and what had happened. And that's when I actually started writing the book. I think there's this misconception that perhaps I wrote the book, in the last 6 months, given where the country's at. It actually started when I was deployed over 10 years ago. So again, I think that for me was the catapulting moment that really brought me into this reality that this was something beyond, really my control at that time. And it was affecting my bearing. And I was a U.S. Air Force officer deployed. I had to get my footing and I had to get some understanding about what was happening.
Before we dive even deeper, can you take a step back and give our listeners a working definition of moral injury? I took a stab at it in the intro.
Sure.
But what's the specific difference between moral injury and PTSD? Because I imagine many people assume they're the same thing or that one leads to the other, or just a basic working definition of moral injury.
Yeah. So I think, just simply put, moral injury is a rupture of conscience. It happens when you've done something, when you've witnessed something, or been forced to stay silent about something that cuts against really your deepest values. And it festers as, shame, guilt, anger, a loss of trust in people and institutions around you. So think of it as your body survived, but your conscience is damaged and or hurt. And I think that you ask a great question about the differences, because that's actually a really important reality, that a lot of people who are dealing with moral injury often go and get help and then get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, because there's still a lack of awareness amongst clinicians about what moral injury is. And so I would think of it this way. Depression says, I feel worthless. Anxiety says, I'm afraid. And then PTSD says, I can't escape what happened to me. PTSD is fear-based. Moral injury says something different. It says, I am not who I thought I was. That's a completely different wound. It's not necessarily your mood, right? It's not your nervous system per se, it's your conscience. And that's why antidepressants don't seem to be very helpful, because it's a function of emotional dysregulation. You're more morally disoriented. And I think that the only thing that starts to fix that moral disorientation is a moral reckoning.
Is feeling guilty a more common term for the same thing?
Correct.
And so, listeners, we want to hear from you. Have you ever carried something that you would now recognize as a moral injury, a choice made in a professional or personal crisis, maybe, that violated your own sense of right and wrong, maybe at the moment or maybe when you thought about it later? Maybe you're a veteran or a healthcare worker or a lawyer, a teacher, a parent, or none of those things, and you've spent years trying to figure out why a particular memory won't leave you alone in this respect. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text with your stories or any question for our guest, Michael Valdovinos, and his new book, Moral Injuries, or about his new book, Moral Injuries When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt. That's the name of the book. I didn't expect such a simple answer to my question. Is this the same as feeling guilty? Is it feeling guilty, but about like really consequential things?
That's correct. And I would say, just not to oversimplify it, I think it's a combination of guilt and also shame. And, folks often ask me as a clinician, and I'm sure clinicians that are listening would agree that often they say, well, how do I know when I actually need to get help? How do I know when it crosses the threshold of, let's say, I saw something happen in my day, throughout my day, and I felt a little guilty about it. I could have done something different. Is that moral injury? The real way to think about this is that when any psychological harm happens or any distress happens, when it starts to impact your ability to carry on in your activities of daily living, that's when you really should start asking yourself the question of whether or not this is something that needs more attention. If it's starting to impact your sleep, if it's starting to impact your ability to concentrate at work, to attend to your family, to give love, receive love, if you're starting to notice drinking patterns to try to numb what you're feeling, if people are giving you a lot of feedback around maybe a change in mood, that's probably a really good sign that this is it's gone from perhaps some moral distress to a moral injury. And so it's a good marker for trying to figure out the difference between, I would say, day-to-day, feelings of guilt and shame to what I describe in the book as a moral sort of crescendo, which is moral distress that keeps happening to sort of the behemoth of what can be moral injury.
Going back to your first 3 days in Afghanistan and how you described looking over that wall and seeing people going about their business and starting to question, the right versus wrong of what you thought the mission there was. Listener writes, it's not clear why the guest thought that hearts and minds could not be won by seeing people over the wall going about their lives. How is it different from, say, the U.S. Marshall Plan in Japan? What would you say to that listener?
Well, I would say that my experience of winning hearts and minds in Afghanistan, I had some experience and I had some awareness of how the mission was going before I even arrived. I also had psychological training that told me to modify behavior and support people and actually change behavior is not a function necessarily of trying to convince them of deeply held beliefs that they have had for generations and generations and generations, and trying to force that upon folks. And so we knew that it wasn't working well, right? We knew that it was a whack-a-mole. You could help a certain village, a group of people, support some of the efforts you were doing in certain parts of Afghanistan, but I would say across the board, it was not a mission that we knew was not only just going to be effective in the moment, but long term, it wasn't sustainable. So we got to a point where we really all started to feel like what we were doing was just putting a Band-Aid on the issue with no real plan moving forward. And of course, I was just, I was living in a sort of microcosm of that, but more broadly, I was always thinking about what's the broader goal, what's the broader reality of me being here and of us being here. And so that's sort of the how I sort of conceptualized our work and what we were doing there. and how I came to the conclusion, and I wouldn't say I'm alone, but how we came to the conclusion that really the approach that we had gone in there with, and now of course it's no secret, isn't really an effective long-term solution for nation building, for regime change, for long-term sustainable democratic shifts.
When you talk about the difficulty of changing people's values, and I guess you came to think it was wrong, some people may think, well, weren't you trying to change like supporters of the Taliban who didn't think girls should be allowed to go to school?
Yeah. We actually, we were trying. I wouldn't say me directly. My mission there was very specific, but more broadly, we were trying to provide support for suspected Taliban to think differently about what they were going to do when they left detention. Right? The farm was one example of that. Right? That was a program that I think, on its surface, was well-intentioned. It was a means to help folks develop a different set of skills that they could perhaps start a business, that they could, cultivate land and farm and not have to go back into, Taliban sort of processes and procedures and oppression of its people. The fact of the matter is, though, that we're talking about really, I think, long-term, foundational, I would argue, harmful practices that folks have had, that part of the culture, right? And so while, yes, I'm sure some of these folks benefited from learning how to farm at scale, the pull to go back into groups like the Taliban was just too strong, and in fact, there was some intel, and we knew that folks were actually going to go right back to doing what they were doing before.
Before we get to some callers, and also you're writing about how to start to heal from moral injury once you recognize it in yourself, you have a striking line about how moral injury can be contagious that I want to make sure to get to, particularly around charged public conflicts. Writing about events like Hamas's attacks on Israel and Israel's attacks on Gaza, you describe how the injury spreads because of, quote, the involvement of supposedly trustworthy authorities, elected officials, peace officers, clergy, judges, doctors, business leaders, who either turn a blind eye, excuse, or actively cover up grave offenses, unquote, from your book. Can you unpack that? How does institutional betrayal turn a public event into a personal wound?
Well, yeah, I think you're bringing up a really important point. And I think what I would say to this is, look, moral injury spreads the way cynicism spreads. When you watch someone you respect compromise their values and survive, maybe even get rewarded for it, something shifts. I think you start to wonder if your principles are maybe, naive, if integrity is just a liability, right? And once enough people in an institution start feeling that way, the culture itself becomes the injury. And I think that's when it stops being personal and it starts being systemic. And I think that we're seeing that in real time, almost on a, if not daily, weekly basis.
Michael in Far Rockaway, you're on WNYC. Hi, Michael.
Oh, first of all, thank you. I've been listening to your show. My wife and I are huge fans. We love that you guys share the facts straight as they are.
Thank you very much.
So I am a little, the backstory to me is I joined the Marine Corps in September 2000. I was part of the 15th MEU in 2001 when the towers went down. We were sent right over there. So I've gone through the whole combat tours, and I've been dealt with PTSD, try to learn how to deal with it throughout the years, different techniques. But this is the first time listening on the radio where I've even come across of this moral, it's so new to me that moral injury, I have never even heard of it. And it makes so much sense how it could be so misdiagnosed. I don't even know how to even begin to even spread it to the veteran communities that we always get so misdiagnosed, or, the typical cocktails of medications and stuff like that, that years go by and by. And I mean, there's a reason why our suicide rates are so high, because it's just even so many new things that happen, like so many undiagnosed things.
So here we are with two Michaels who are both Afghanistan war veterans. Michael Valdivinos, talk to our caller, Michael.
Yeah, well, thanks for calling, Michael, and appreciate your service, brother. And what I'll tell you is this: look, it's not. Don't feel surprised. Try not to feel surprised, or certainly not. Don't feel surprised about the way that you feel. I think the first thing that I want you to know is that a lot of what people are feeling right now, including yourself, isn't irrational. And I think that's step one. I'm also really glad that you're tuning in, because I think what you can do is you can serve as a force multiplier. Now that you're listening to what we're talking about, now that you have the term in place, I'm sure that you have other veterans that you can reach out to. I'm sure you're in a tight-knit community around folks that you can then start to spread the word about what this is. What I'll also say is there's some good news here for you. The good news is that if you have an ability to seek help at a veterans clinic or hospital, those are actually the few places in the United States where moral injury not only is now recognized, but there is some decent treatment happening. And I talk a little bit about what those treatments are in my book, Michael. But if you have an ability to seek those services, go there and actually talk to them about moral injury. Because again, oftentimes it's just you reaching out and saying, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. I've heard this new term. What services do you have for that? And some of the best work is actually happening at the VA.
I completely agree with that. I just have one question. When you say moral injuries are spreadable, what do you mean by that? Like when you see an action, is that, because I always came to the rationalization of like, what I'm doing is survival. I'm trying to survive. So if whatever this man is doing or my brother in arms is doing, I'm going to try to emulate and try to come out of this hellhole that we're in.
Yeah.
So how is that? What do you mean when it's spreadable?
Right. I think that's a great question. So, there's a couple ways to think about it. It's spreadable in the sense that if let's say that, you see something or something happens to you that causes moral distress or moral injury, and you don't act or you don't do anything about it, and other people see it, there is a chance there that can be normalized, right? But that's just a fancy way of saying that it starts to become something that feels normal, right? People go, well, you know what? If Michael didn't do anything about it, it's probably not that important. I probably shouldn't have to have done anything about it either. And if that happens time after time, or it starts happening, then people just start feeling like, hey, you know what? It's not that big a deal to have to do anything about this. The other way to think about this, and maybe this is the way that you're thinking about this, is that if you do take action, whether that's getting help, whether that's intervening, whether that's stepping up or speaking out about some injustice or something that you feel isn't right, and then other people see you doing that, that's something that in psychology we call modeling. Right? We do that with kiddos, right? We do that sometimes with family where we try to model more appropriate behavior, but that also can spread. And in fact, I think that right now what's happening in the United States, that we're hitting a moral reckoning, that where we're starting to see people step up and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to live by my real values. I'm going to live by a North Star. I'm going to try to do the right thing. That's goodness that spreads. And so whether that's in a military community like you, or in a context, or whether that's for civilian folks, it's a good idea because it happens almost, as a consequence of you just stepping up and trying to follow your North Star.
Michael, thank you so much for your call. Good luck to you and your family. And we have a few more minutes with Michael Valdivinos, clinical psychologist, veteran and trauma specialist, and author now of the book, Moral Injuries, When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt. We have a text that says, I feel guilt and shame for being a bully when in middle school and high school I verbally abused some fellow students. These actions still haunt me. I am 60 years old. And Elizabeth, a retired nurse in Brooklyn, is calling in. Elizabeth, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to your guest. This is so incredibly important, and I think it'll take a while for many of us to unpack all these layers. But I just wanted to say that during the beginning and the height of COVID, I was aware, and I am now very aware, that nurses who took care of patients with COVID, mostly in hospitals, have experienced some of what he's describing. They were not giving the care they knew they were trained to give, and at times they were not providing care. And that was the consequence, one, of this infection, but I also think of the management of the hospital systems in the city. And there is a big disconnect between the people who do the work and the people who run the places. And I think nurses have suffered from this, continued to, and have not received any of the kinds of, for lack of a better word, therapy, treatment, even being able to express verbally what they saw and what happened. So that's it.
What's the failure, though, that you're describing on the part of nurses when they were so overwhelmed, in many cases, with so many patients at once and the risk to themselves? What's the thing that you're describing that led to guilt or shame?
Not caring for people the way they knew they should be, not going to someone who needed someone to come to them, not doing skin care. People were dying at a horrific rate and were deteriorating in ways that we could have done better with. That was not the fault of the nurses. And I think the rest of the population, and it's not their fault either, were clapping at 7 o'clock. There was a parade. No one was fighting extraordinarily hard to get nurses proper protective equipment, and then afterwards to say, we'll give you time off from work to get the needed therapy.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Here's one more text that also applies to healthcare professions. This says, moral injury has been applied more recently to physicians practicing in the U.S. healthcare system. As a physician myself, I deal with this daily, practicing in a system that does not meet the basic needs of my patients and being a witness to the spiral of economic and health consequences. So as we come toward the end of the segment, Michael, give us a thought on the best methods for healing from one's own moral injuries. You said before that some of the usual medications for depression and such are ineffective in this. We did a segment the other day about President Trump allowing more research into psychedelics. And one of the things that somebody I saw in conjunction with that say was, this could be good for moral injury. They actually cited moral injury. And I wonder if there are cultures or faith traditions that handle moral injury better than Western secular therapeutic culture does. You're a psychologist. So to any of that, as we enter our closing couple of minutes.
Yeah, all great questions. And just to go back really quickly on the comments around nurses and healthcare professionals, I don't want to minimize really the comments that were made, because those are two really important health professions that not only just in COVID, but certainly before and after still experience high rates of moral injury. And so that's, I completely empathize and agree with that. That is a population that is currently being researched that we don't know yet enough about, but that what I think we understand what they have to deal with and the choices they have to make on a daily basis that leads to moral injury.
And this goes to the healing question, too, because both the nurse who called in and the physician who texted put this in a systemic context, right? The text said, practicing in a system that does not meet the basic needs of my patients. And so how does an individual heal from that systemic moral injury that they may feel powerless to change?
Right. Yeah. So, I'll try to answer this as succinctly as possible. And I want to be honest here, because the easy answers actually make it worse. Healing from moral injury isn't about necessarily feeling quote unquote better. It's about becoming someone your conscience can live with again, right? Particularly after somebody has experienced a significant moral injury. And that starts with, naming it correctly. I think that's a big first start. Most people are treating this, as we talked about, like depression or and really aren't getting anywhere because the target is wrong. Then it requires real witness. not venting, not reassurance, having someone sit with the full weight of what happened without minimizing it is really, really, really important. So premature reassurance, sort of like you did the best you could, can actually deepen the wound. And I think then comes accountability without this idea of like self-destruction, being able to say, I did this, it caused harm, and I am still capable of acting rightly is really, really important. And then finally, action, right? Our conscious needs evidence that we're still capable of acting according to our values, that we can seek amends, that we can advocate, that we can bear witness, something real. I'll leave you guys with this, that there isn't a single dedicated moral injury clinic yet. There's some great work coming out of Boston VA, and I write about some of these treatments in my work in these places. Harvard has a great center where they approach this from an angle of spirituality and religion. But I think typically folks get treatment in settings that already handle trauma and complex psychological stress. So that includes outpatient mental health practices, integrated behavioral health care settings in the United States, and specialized programs like we talked about at the VA. And I would advocate for folks to say, look, when you go and seek help for this, ask for treatments like cognitive processing therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. Those are evidence-based treatments that have shown sort of good outcomes for moral injury. But I'll leave it that, we still need a lot of research and we still need a lot of advocacy around this. I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Michael Valdovinos, author now of Moral Injuries, When Good Conscience Suffers in a World of Hurt. You've obviously struck a chord with many listeners. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you, Brian.